The Russian Revolution had multiple causes, but if we condense them into three key factors that rendered the revolution ultimately inevitable, they include economic inequality, political oppression, and the impact of World War I. Firstly, economic inequality was a significant issue within the Russian Empire, which comprised a deeply stratified society. The majority of the population lived in poverty, while a small elite held an overwhelming share of the nation's wealth.
Secondly, political repression played a crucial role in the Russian Empire, which was governed by autocracy in which the Tsar held absolute power. The absence of any popular representation meant that the people had no voice in the governance of the country and were frequently subjected to arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. Thirdly, the First World War inflicted a substantial blow to the Russian Empire. This costly and bloody conflict resulted in a decline of the Russian economy and added to the overall challenges faced by the nation.
After the First Revolution, Parliament made minor improvements to working conditions. Working hours were reduced to less than 10 hours, and wages rose slightly. The workers did not get everything they wanted, but the progress of the reform gave them great hopes. Nicholas II, who had the right to dissolve Parliament, made the Liberals hold back by dissolving Parliament twice for continuing to rebel against him. However, Prime Minister Stolypin's reforms, which began after 1907, were aimed at radical policies such as rural reform, guaranteeing equal rights for citizens, and improving workers' lives, and Liberal Party members eventually supported them.
However, in the 1910s, the revolutionary movement began to flare up rapidly again. Rural reform greatly improved the farmers' lives, but landlords, who were the culprits of exploitation in the past, did not give farmers the land they wanted. Disappointed with the reforms, the peasants began to conceive of taking the land from the landlords again in the revolutionary way. In addition, in the progress of policy promotion, Stolypin continued to show indecisiveness, and eventually the Liberal parties were disappointed with this and withdrew their support. In the midst of these events, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II judged that Stolypin's reform would weaken his power, so he rallied with the conservatives and withdrew their support. Stolypin, the Prime Minister of Russia, was criticized by all, including peasants, nobles, socialists, liberals, and conservatives. He was assassinated on September 1st, 1911, while attending a performance at the Opera Theater in Kiev. He was shot 3 times by a young revolutionary named Dmitry Bagrat. In this way, the reform was completely in vain, and the people who had once seen the light of freedom would not tolerate the situation any longer. College students and intellectuals began to assemble, and workers who were still dissatisfied with the forced labor eventually began to strike. To make matters worse, sporadic rebellion by the military again plunged Russia into chaos, and in this situation, World War I broke out in 1914. Russia entered World War I, but a series of defeats severely damaged the morale of the Russian army. From August 1915, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia assumed the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. For a long time, the Empress and the Tsar had been conned by a mystic named Rasputin and had confused the fate of the country. While the Tsar was away from the capital, Empress Alexandra Petrovna intervened in state policy, and Rasputin joined her in controlling domestic affairs. The Russian people began to be outraged by the Empress's senseless behavior. The rumors of sexual relations between Rasputin and the Empress were spreading throughout the country. Rumors among the people greatly reduced the authority of the Tsar, and a sense of crisis surrounding the imperial family began to spread. The strike movement, which had been quiet at the beginning of the war, revived in anger at the Russian government's absurd behavior. Under these circumstances, the Bolsheviks, who advocated violent revolution, began calling for a revolutionary war. Workers who had turned militant increasingly supported the Bolsheviks, and numerous Menshevik members who were in conflict over pros and cons of war began to convert to the Bolsheviks. Workers' strikes erupted in 1916, and some troops began to protect workers by fighting against the police who came out to quell the protests. Aristocrats close to the imperial family killed Rasputin to save the Tsar's authority, but public sentiment was already at an irreversible level. In February 1917, the terrible war and the collapse of the transport network choked the supply chain and depleted the capital city of St. Petersburg. After the food supply was corrupt, people couldn't even buy bread, and all workers protesting for bread were fired.
Women led the protests demanding an end to the war and the return of their men. The bread protest gradually turned into a political demonstration. Almost all the starving citizens turned their backs on the government. In response, the Tsar dispatched police and soldiers to subdue the protesters by force. To make matters worse, before the war was over, Russia was faced with another crisis. The army continued to fire mercilessly on civilians following orders, but the soldiers were overwhelmed by a constant sense of cynicism. On February 26, 1917, the army, which had been ordered to open fire on the crowds, suddenly opened fire on the police.
Something earth-shaking happened. Soldiers killed the commander who had ordered them to open fire on their families. And on February 27th, thousands of soldiers joined the demonstrators, occupied the capital's railway station, government offices and prisons, and freed political activists. The government collapsed. Parliament and party representatives created an ad hoc committee for state functioning after the Tsar's flight. Meanwhile, on the other side of the palace, Social Democrats and leftist intellectuals convened a meeting at which systems of workers' deputies, the Provisional Executive Committee of the Soviets, were established.
The Mensheviks, who were supported by the majority in the Socialist Party, became the center of the Soviets. In this way, a dual power system was formed in which two forces, liberalism and socialism, dominated the central government. On March 2, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia signed an edict abdicating the throne. Thus, the Russian monarchy completely disappeared into history, and the February Revolution was completed. Since Russia was still at war, the provisional government formed by the liberal leaders and the socialist Soviets had agreed to cooperate with each other. At that time, most of the army and people who led the revolution were on the side of the Soviets, so the provisional government had no choice but to need their support. In April 1917, when Russia's parliamentary politics was finding its way, Lenin, who had been in exile, returned to Russia with German help.
Unlike the Mensheviks, who supported moderate change, Lenin, who led the Bolsheviks, advocated a break with the provisional government and a violent revolution by the workers. Lenin wanted to deny everything the February Revolution had achieved. Even his own Bolsheviks could not help but be surprised by such an unimaginably radical assertion, but Lenin began to control them with his unique personality and excellent rhetorical skills. In this way, a full-scale conflict between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks within the Soviets, sophists and divisions began to form. The Bolsheviks shouted, "All power to Soviets!" And on July 4, 1917, 500,000 Bolshevik supporters began to protest intensively. The Soviets and the provisional government, still heavily Menshevik, agreed to sort things out and immediately issued an order for Lenin's arrest. In addition, they began to suppress the Bolsheviks mercilessly, putting pressure on them from all directions. In the end, Lenin was forced to flee again. After the July chaos was resolved, the suppression of the Bolsheviks ended. The Bolsheviks then quickly rallied their forces, mobilized workers and soldiers, and organized an army called the Red Guard. After August, the provisional government lost its authority due to coups, endless wars, economic crises, food shortages, and lack of will for reform, and the public began to support the Soviets more and more. Eventually, the Bolsheviks chanting "All power to the Soviets" rose to the top. In the Soviet elections held in September, the Bolsheviks won a majority over the Mensheviks for the first time, and Trotsky, who supported Lenin, was elected chairman. After Lenin secretly returned to Russia, he convened an underground meeting of the Central Committee for October 10th and plotted a rebellion. However, their plan was disseminated in the press by party members who opposed the rebellion, and the Bolshevik conspiracy was exposed. The Bolsheviks organized the Military Revolutionary Committee on October 20th and began recruiting soldiers to support them. Soldiers who did not want to be taken to the front became loyal to the Bolsheviks, and thousands of Bolshevik supporters were gathering on the streets of the capital. In fact, the Bolsheviks did not occupy the capital for the revolution. Rather, the reason they gathered in the capital was to defend themselves from counter-revolutionary forces. But things changed drastically when Lenin appeared. Lenin urged the Central Committee to start a revolution quickly, and on October 25, 1917, something historic happened. The Bolsheviks staged a coup d'etat seized the post office, railways, and telephone offices, stormed the Winter Palace, and overthrew the provisional government. At the Congress of Soviets, the Mensheviks stormed out of the meeting room, saying that they could never accept the Bolsheviks' act of insurrection. The Bolsheviks, who took control of the Soviets, officially declared the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in January 1918, and thus the first socialist state was born. The Bolsheviks abolished all discrimination and privileges based on race, class, hierarchy, religion, and status, and confiscated all property of the bourgeoisie. Many people, including workers, peasants, and minorities, supported this change, while the supporters of Mensheviks, liberals, and monarchists rallied the counter-revolutionary White Guards and decided to fight against the Bolsheviks. In March 1918, Lenin signed a humiliating pact with Germany to get out of the World War I, allowing him to focus on the civil war in Russia. And in June 1918, the civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the counter-revolutionary White Army began in earnest. The large-scale battles leading up to 1920 had a devastating toll on both sides, the White Army and Lenin's Red Army. Even the people turned their backs on the White Army, who defended the bourgeoisie and the monarchy, and was severely divided. Eventually, by March 1920, most of the White Army had been wiped out, and the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, had finally seized power in Russia. Meanwhile, in July 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were all executed due to the Bolshevik Red Terror.
The Romanovs were executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. They were shot to death, and their bodies were buried in a shallow grave. Their bodies were not found until 1991 and were reburied in the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. The execution of the Romanovs was a major event in Russian history. It marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and the beginning of the Soviet era. It was also a brutal act of violence that shocked the world.
The Bolshevik Soviets also experienced major anti-government protests due to the excessive conscription of peasants and grain grabs carried out for the Civil War. Despite this backlash, however, Soviet Russia slowly took its place in the world. At the Congress of Soviets held on December 30th, 1922, an agreement was reached to unite the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakh Soviet republics.
Finally, the Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or USSR, was born. One day in 1922, Stalin was appointed first secretary of the Communist Party. Stalin's appointment as first secretary was a turning point in Soviet history. It gave him the power to consolidate his grip on the party and state and set the stage for absolute power. Following Stalin's appointment, a sweeping and violent purge was initiated in the Soviet Union. Thank you for watching the video, The Russian Revolution Part 2, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, Cindy, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.